I guess I'm wearing two hats, or half a hat on each side of my head. I want to talk, I've got probably too much to say, so I'll try to sort of condense it a little bit. I want to argue that last year, 2011, was a turning point in something I'll call an international but not a global crisis of social justice. That it was caused by the hardships and inequalities intensified by the financial crisis of 2007-2008. And I also want to narrate with pictures, and that's the main reason I'm using PowerPoint today, quite quickly the emergence of a wave of protests internationally that began in North Africa and that then simultaneously spread to Europe and North America. I want to explain why it's not a coincidence that the Occupy Wall Street movement started in New York City. I want to examine this movement in particular and the initiatives arising out of it with regard to legislation, unions, and ideas about a new multilateralism that sort of reflect its demands or strident lack of demands, its perspectives on policy and also on the state. And then finally, I want to look at the potential for linkages in areas of common ground with traditional social change agents such as trade unions, civil society organizations, and political parties, and ask whether there's a possibility for partnership. So the narrative begins. When 25-year-old Tunisian street vendor Mohamed Bouazizi set himself on fire on December 17th to protest the harassment and humiliation inflicted on him by municipal officials and the police, I don't think any of us could have foreseen the explosion of social protest that happened. These events overthrew repressive governments in Tunisia, Egypt, Yemen, and Libya. There were civil uprisings in Bahrain and Syria still going on, major protests in Algeria, Iraq, Jordan, Kuwait, Morocco, Oman. There were demonstrations in Lebanon, in Mauritania, Saudi Arabia, Sudan, and the Western Sahara, and elsewhere. Even the Palestine 194 movement in the UN to gain, for the Palestinian National Authority to gain UN's membership for the state of Palestine is in some sense a part of this movement. It wasn't confined to the Arab world. In many ways, there's a precedent in Iran's 2009 Green Revolution movement and antecedents, important antecedents in Europe and North America, including the Indignados movement in Portugal and Greece and Spain, and the Occupy Wall Street movement in the US. Two slides with words. So why was 2011 the turning point? I'm going to argue that although the international financial system experienced a profound shock in 2007 when the subprime mortgage crisis developed into a financial sector crisis, it didn't become a full-blown global economic crisis until 2008 when the US government was compelled to take control of its mortgage finance-related government-sponsored enterprises. IndyMac, Fannie Mae, and Freddie Mac. This year also saw investment banks Bear Stearns and Lehman Brothers collapse, along with Washington Mutual Bank and the multinational insurance company AIG, which was taken over by the US government. And during the same period in the UK, we saw Northern Rock, the first large British bank to experience a bank run in something like 150 years, was also taken over by the government, as was the mortgage lender Bradford and Bingley. I don't know if I'm pronouncing that correctly. In addition, global concern among policymakers led to the expansion of the G20 in November 2008, so that not only finance ministers and central bankers, but also heads of state were beginning to meet. Their November 15th, 2008 declaration stated that the global cooperation and a commitment to market principles, open trade and investment, excuse me, and effectively regulated financial markets were seen as the key to economic growth, employment, and poverty reduction. But by mid-2009, the G20 government's subsequent coordinated interventions had largely resolved the interbank crisis, and the stimulus policies they'd adopted to boost aggregate demand were being cooperatively pursued. And in addition, the financial institutions in the US considered too big to fail had been bailed out, And in just one quarter, profitability had been restored to the financial sector, 1 quarter of negative profits as of fourth quarter of 2008. So, although the financial system recovered in 2009, at least by the measure of restored profitability, the credit crisis persisted. Lending to non-financial entities remained extremely sluggish, and despite these policies to stimulate aggregate demand, ordinary citizens in the US, the UK, and Europe continue to experience falling incomes, unemployment, increased poverty and inequality, foreclosures, homelessness, and other effects of the crisis. So that by June of 2010, when the G20 met in Toronto, it had split, with most of the G7 countries deciding to adopt austerity policies to shore up their sovereign debts and falling revenues. And on top of the original crisis, this was threatening trade and economic growth worldwide. So, as a consequence, a wide group of people in all of these countries was subjected to a crisis resolution that favored the narrow private interests of the financial sector and high-income earners in all sectors. Citizens in the most economically advanced countries were compelled, in a sense, to pay twice. First, toward the direct costs of the bailout, and then with economic slowdown and the pain of fiscal austerity. In sum, by late 2010, the banking crisis had become a generalized fiscal crisis, compounded by just a dramatic failure of accountability on the part of advanced governments and the financial sector, whose leaders all failed to grasp the injustice of saving banks at the expense of people and the health of the global economy. So, I won't go in, I did in the paper, but I won't go into the ILO's World of Work report, which I think is very important in showing a number of things. The social unrest index, I think I'll just note to say that in the Arab region, in the advanced economies, the risk of social unrest seems to be rising more than elsewhere. One thing that I found very interesting about the report as well, this is the last thing I'll say about it, is that although social unrest has historically been understood in terms of civil wars and their root causes, it points out that recent literature show other factors emerging as determining unrest in the new forms that it can take. And these became the rule rather than the exception in 2011. These factors include things like income inequality, the perception of injustice, fiscal consolidation and budget cuts, higher food prices, the heavy-handedness of the state, the presence of an educated but dissatisfied population, and the presence of mass and social media, which were instrumental in organizing protests. In the Arab region in particular, just a few figures about unemployment. The world's highest rates of unemployment, including for people with graduate degrees, average rate of employment almost 15%. In Tunisia, dramatic rise in unemployment during the period of Ben Ali's taking power, very high female unemployment rates, and very high youth unemployment rates. So in the background, leading up to the Arab Spring, was the so-called Green Revolution movement in Iran, which sprang up in 2009 after the regime in Tehran overturned or suppressed election results that would have gone against the ruling cadres. Millions of Iranians, including youth, women, educated professionals, and others protested for several weeks. Also, in the 5 weeks between Mohammad Bouazizi's immolation and the January 25th Day of Rage in Tahrir Square, the Qatari news outlet Al Jazeera and social media of all kinds became critical conduits for information about protests and platforms for calls to participate. Even Secretary of State Hillary Clinton testified before the U.S. Senate Foreign Relations Committee, and she said, I quote, "Viewership of Al Jazeera is going up in the United States because it is real news. You may not agree with it, but you feel like you're getting real news around the clock instead of a million commercials and, arguments between talking heads and the kind of stuff that we do on our news that is not providing information to us, let alone foreigners," unquote. So the social networks certainly fostered the spread of protest between Bouazizi's December 17th immolation and his death on January 4th. World Bank's index of internet usage shows that more than 35% of Tunisians have internet access, and more than 25% of Egyptians. So just as Tunisia's revolution had its spark in Mohamed Bouazizi, Egypt had its own sparks. One was Asma Mahfouz, one of the founders of the April 6th youth movement, which formed to support textile workers in the Nile Delta and began organizing mass demonstrations as far back as 2008 in response to election fraud, to demand higher wages and under pressures due to the economic crisis. Another spark was Wael Ghonim, who created a website called We Are All Khalid Said. Khalid Said was an unemployed or underemployed 28-year-old who was brutally beaten to death in Cairo, rather in Alexandria, for his exposure of police corruption. And concurrent with these revolutions in North Africa unfolding in late 2010 and early 2011, anti-austerity protesters unified under the name Uncut in both the US and UK began occupying the storefronts of banks and multinational corporations accused of tax avoidance and bad corporate citizenship. In the UK, the corporate targets included Vodafone, and also implicated were the policies of Prime Minister David Cameron's Big Society initiative, which wanted to replace services formerly provided by the government with volunteerism. In the US, the main corporate target was Bank of America, which paid no taxes in either 2009 or 2010. And these protests also criticized the increased political influence afforded corporations by Citizens United, which was
hiding behind the poster there.
Yeah. This is yeah. So Citizens United basically allowed unlimited donations on the part of corporations to spending in political campaigns. Citizens United was also implicated in an important protest that took place in the capital city of the state of Wisconsin when the governor attempted to strip collective bargaining rights from public sector workers in that state. Between the 14th and 20th of February, these protests grew from a few thousand to over 100,000 as protesters occupied the state capitol building. In the spring, on May 15th, tens of thousands marched to Madrid's Puerta del Sol, along with tens of thousands more in dozens of other cities, frustrated with an unemployment rate of over 20%, a lack of opportunity, and political deadlock. These indignados turned a one-day march into a 3-week-long self-governing occupation. And the occupation of public space, I want to point out at this point, which all these pictures show, has become one of the defining characteristics of this new global protest movement. So 10 days after these protests began in Madrid, they cropped up in Spain as well. The first week, about 100,000 Athenians went into the streets. By the second week, there were 500,000 as the protests coalesced in the occupation of Syntagma Square, and Greece's sovereign debt crisis dragged on. After Greece, there were encampments that began in other cities throughout Israel and different places. The reasons given had become familiar by this point. Not enough good jobs, high cost of living, a corrupt political system, and only the rich getting richer. Then in early July in New York City, there was a 3-week occupation on the streets near City Hall known as Bloombergville. That's the upper left slide.